whilst the tools of epigenetics merely provide calculations, whilst the tool of epigenetic research may provide data.
Yes, the research tool known as epigenetics. Kraut, buddy, you need to either seriously take some time off and take the effort to learn about what you're talking about, or just not talk about it. Either way,
it's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more!
Kraut caught me in a lie, oh no, and he says it's a really amazing lie.
So amazing, in fact, that I'm going to show you why this is amazing at the end of this video, rather than now, as the cherry on top of the cake.
Yeah, whatever, let's just skip to it.
And now, for the last part of this video, as I have announced at the start, I have something special. Something for which we have to return to the start. Do you remember the book quote from the beginning of this video? What is missing here? A paragraph, 2 paragraphs, an entire page, or even more? Now, since it's missing and you might assume alt-right science man is honest, it must be something completely insignificant to the subject at hand, right? Is it? And it was just one sentence.
When heredity is important, and it almost always is for complex traits like behavior, it is now possible to identify specific genes by using the methods of molecular genetics, the topic of Chapter 9. You cut out the part of that quote that disproves your point.
What?
So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. The sentence saying molecular genetics exists completely debunks my argument that quantitative genetics exists. Here it is, big and bold for all to see, the missing sentence, what I was trying to hide for you that completely changes the meaning of everything else that was said. Now you guys can see how I led you all down the primrose path. But don't worry guys, it gets better.
And it gets even better.
In Chapter 2, we get an overview of Mendel's laws of heritability and how Mendel's law of heritability can be used to make predictive models. However, the only conclusive way of determining if a child has inherited the disease is through testing, the kind of testing done through the methods of molecular genetics. And this same pattern repeats itself throughout the book.
And there's like 5 minutes of this. He just goes on and on about how you can do molecular genetics. And he thinks this is just a savage debunking of me because, I don't know, I guess maybe he thinks I'm opposed to molecular genetics.
Analyzing DNA sequences, gene mapping with chromosomes, and, you know, all that laboratory work that, according to alt-right science man, only
dumber scientists
do.
No, buddy, I was referring to the dumber scientists like that chem savant from the last video. It's about this mythomania that you have to find the genes to do genetics. Nobody is against molecular genetics. This is an argument that you just made up and you're just having with yourself. What we're against is your methodological supremacism that this is the only way to know anything about heritability. That's what's stupid. And nowhere in anything you quoted does it say that finding specific genes are required to make heritability estimates. Let's just take your interpretation of Plowman at face value. Once you find the genes, you can use molecular genetics to trump quantitative genetics according to Plowman. But until then, it's still perfectly valid to use the quantitative genetics data. Let me show you something here. Here are genome-wide association studies from 2008. And back then, they were only able to find a heritability of height within the United States at 5% and 3%. So what are you going to say? Are you going to say that these methods of inferring the heritability of height are superior than the old twin studies when they give these sanity test fail results? Heck, even when the molecular genetics data supersedes the quantitative genetics data in terms of predictive validity, which I predict it will in about 20 years, you can still use twin studies and family correlation data. It's not like that data goes bad or suddenly becomes wrong just because newer methods have been established.
Whilst he is arguing for the superiority of observing selective breeding in his video, he is showing in the background footage of molecular genetic analysis being done in a laboratory. What you are seeing here are Western blots.
Nope, it's actually something known as agarose gel electrophoresis. Good try though. And no, contrary to the little narrative you have going on in your head, I am not opposed to this, nor am I opposed to the usage of Western blot. What I am opposed to are your stupid standards that these kinds of things are required when making general heritability estimates for highly polygenic traits or complex traits such as height or IQ. Twin studies, family relations, and subtest heritability analysis or factor analysis work just fine for this. Now, before I continue, Kraut's video got limited stated. It wasn't by me or anyone who calls themselves alt-right. The flag flagging was organized by user King Lazia from Pol. This guy has in the past organized flaggings of Millennial Woes and me, and organized a doxing campaign against Mike Enoch and The Right Stuff. And before you shed any tears for Kraut losing his video, remember that this is the guy who tried to get Rage After Storm fired from her job for a video she made. Kraut is not some principled supporter of free speech. I don't know if he claimed to be, so I'm not calling a hypocrite on this. I'm just saying to others that you should not have any sympathy for Kraut being censored when Kraut himself is censorious. I have ignored a lot of silly little snipes in your videos, Kraut, like putting in the little Nazi characters. It was at first kind of a dubious guilt by association, but in there you were attacking this thing that may or may not even exist called the alt-right. And in this alt-right, that may include Hitlerites. So whatever, I just ignored it when you were making generalized attacks on the alt-right. But now you're doing a video specifically about me, and so you're obviously insinuating that I am a Hitlerite. You know Nazis gave homosexuals the gas, right? Kraut, you do realize that I would have been gassed under the Hitler regime. But enough of that jibber jabber, let's get into the rest of his video. So the first 5 minutes or so of Kraut's video is just authority posturing. He claims that the number of sources in his video was fine because that's how many a typical peer-reviewed genetics paper has.
In STEM, source lists are incredibly long. To quote a Dutch chemistry student,
"If I hand in a paper that only has 7 sources, people will look at me and ask, is this supposed to be a joke?"
you will find that every paper has 30, 50, or even over 100 sources.
Okay, I'm not saying actual genetics papers have too many sources or that they are adding papers they haven't read. I'm saying that you are doing this, Kraut. Pointing out that academic journal genetics papers do this doesn't mean anything regarding your videos because your videos are not that.
And since these videos are by now made with the help of actual STEM researchers and academics, it comes without saying that I have eventually resigned to put myself under the same standard of work for these videos that they would require and are happy with. In short, that means that the typical anti-social justice video with sources, if existent at all, being some newspaper article.
Your whole argument at this point is about methodology. Your 54-minute video was basically Find the Genes, the movie. And given that this argument is almost all about methodology with a few little exceptions of like what Sandra said, because it's about methodology, you don't need a whole lot of sources for this kind of an argument. You've made the same video 3 times now and you're having these problems because you don't know what science is. Let's say Jim has a very detailed mechanistic theory and Bob has a much more generalized theory. Bob's theory makes really good predictions. Jim's theory, which is the more mechanistic theory, makes shit predictions or no predictions at all. But Jim, he insists that his theory is better and is real science because he's working at a much lower level of mechanism. He's working at the nuts and bolts of how the universe works, while Bob's theories are more general. Again, going back to the heritability of height in 2008. There were genome-wide dissociation studies looking for the heritability of height in the United States. One of them found it was 3% heritable. One of them found it was 5% heritable. Twin studies, which reliably show a heritability of height being around 80% within the United States. Well, I guess that's all nonsense, right? Because the molecular genetics study from 2008 say it's at most 5%. And these people are working at the molecular genetics level. And that's better, right? That sounds like something Peter Griffin would say, but it's Kraut's argument in a nutshell. Science is about forming hypotheses that are able to predict things. A hypothesis is falsified if its predictions are wrong. If you have a highly detailed mechanistic theory, and I have a much more general theory, but my more general theory is making better predictions than your mechanistic theory, then the scientific approach would be to take the more generalized theory. If you want to say that the more detailed mechanistic theory is better, well then by what standard? Why? Why is it better? Your own personal judgment that it feels more scientific because it's more detailed and it's more complex and it's getting down into the weeds? Now, Kraut, I have a mechanistic explanation, genetic effects and environmental effects. Oh, is that not specific enough for you? You need to know specifically what genes. You want to go down to the molecular genetic level? Oh, that's the correct level to operate at. You need to go down to the molecular genetic level. That's the correct level. No lower than that, but no higher than that. Well then, why not to the subatomic level? Why not explain things in terms of gluons and up quarks and down quarks? There, once we started explaining things at the subatomic level, then we would be getting really rigorous. And I think that's where we need to go. So we need to withhold judgment on everything everything else until we start to explain things down at the subatomic level, because that's a layer below the molecular genetics level. Why not? I mean, if lower is better, if more mechanistic is better, then why wouldn't a subatomic based explanation be better? Now, I believe that in the future, genome-wide association studies will become superior to the older ways of inferring heritability, and in some ways they may be superior today. But that could be in 5 years, that could be in 100 years. And when that day comes, you can say that you'd prefer molecular genetic data over the twin study data. But the twin study data doesn't suddenly become invalid at that point. Okay, so you have some more modern artillery pieces in your arsenal, but those siege guns from World War I can still kick your ass. They didn't suddenly stop working just because you got some newer models. You know, during the Iraq War, the US Navy used an old World War II battleship to do some shore bombardment. It still works. And in some particular instances, older methods may still be better. And what Kraut does throughout the video is try to paint this methodological argument as a criticism of the alt-right. No, Kraut, that's a dishonest framing. You're literally at war with the field of psychology. The Wikipedia page on the heritability of intelligence actually does a very good job explaining the issue. They say the expert consensus is that by adulthood, which is usually age 24, the heritability of IQ is going to be 0.75. Now, I actually have a criticism of this number, and I think that they don't properly control for the reliability of IQ tests, and that when you do this, the number is closer to 80%, but whatever, it's a minor quibble, it doesn't really matter in practice. Kraut's trying to frame this as a methodological battle between him, along with his gaggle of misfit scientists, versus the alt-right, or more narrowly, me, the AltHype. But in reality, he's at least at war with the field of psychology and the Wikipedia page on the heritability of intelligence.
After a segment in which the alt-right science man declares how obsolete, useless, stupid, fallacious, and impractical molecular genetic analysis is, the alt-right science man proceeds to a segment praising his amazing alternative that is based on mathematical correlations and supposedly makes molecular genetic analysis obsolete, whilst in the background showing the very molecular genetic analysis which he claims is obsolete and unnecessary. What on earth were you thinking when you edited this video together? Did you really think people would be dumb enough to not realize this? This is stuff that, at least in Germany as far as I know, high school students are taught when they are 17 years old. So you don't even need a biology degree to know this. The dishonest nature of this presentation by alt-right science man speaks for itself. Bashing molecular biology and then presenting a statistical method as superior, while in the background showing stock footage images of the very laboratory work that alt-right science man claims is obsolete.
And this is you losing your mind. I was making a video where I was talking and I found some B-roll footage about researchers doing genetics stuff. That's the footage I used because that's what I could be arsed to find and download. Get a grip. What's amazing is that he keeps mocking me as alt-right science man, and that's because he is obsessed with all the trappings of science TM, but not the scientific method. For example, his and Sandra's hand-waving that intelligence is a super-duper complex black box thing that cannot be quantified or operationalized because there's a million and one little things going on, boop, 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 right? That is just their sort of surface level, first impression sort of feeling about the topic. But there's nothing scientific about imagining that intelligence and just proclaiming it unoperationalizable. I want to move away from the issue of heritability here and onto the issue of intelligence, because this is a good illustration of scientific versus non-scientific thinking. Spearman's hypothesis, way back in 1904, was Charles Spearman's hypothesis that any cognitive test was indeed a test of particular skills learned, sure, but also it was a test of an underlying general intelligence, that there was something underlying all mental activity, from riding a bike to building a birdhouse to doing a spelling test, that was a general intelligence factor. It started with the observation that kids who were good at one thing tended to be good at another. Of course, you could come up with all sorts of environmental explanations for this, but Spearman found that it wasn't random. Sure, kids who put more effort into school will do better at everything in school, all else being equal. But Spearman found that some subjects were better predictors of general performance in other subjects, that they were better predictors of general academic performance. And that was the beginning of research on this proposed proposed general intelligence factor. Today, arguments for the G factor don't have to do with the dendritic spines or the myelin, they have to do with making predictions. This is also why IQ tests per se don't matter as much as you might think, because literally any cognitive task is going to be G-loaded. IQ tests just tend to be a little bit more G-loaded. More G-loaded cognitive tasks are better predictors of performance on other tasks, and they are better predictors of your ability to learn and your ability to improve the IQ score. And also, more G-loaded tasks and questions, one's performance on those tends to be more heritable and less malleable, which are two separate things but related things. So it's important to say they're both more heritable and harder to change. Here's a crude way to think about it. You have this little ball in the middle. That's G. Outside of G is cognitive performance. This could be on an IQ test, on the SATs, or even grades in school. Obviously, grades in school will be much less G-loaded than your score on an IQ test, but even things like tying your shoe or riding a bike will, to a very small degree, be influenced by the general intelligence factor. And so when people say, you can't reduce intelligence to a single number, well, actually, you kinda can. In fact, reducing it to a single number has up to now been the most scientific way of looking at intelligence. It's a little bit more complicated than that because of the G factor, but then there's also sub-factors of that. And so it's not quite a single number, but it can be reduced down to this and operationalized. That was the whole point of the G factor. Science means making valid predictions. So the G factor, predictive validity, is falsifiable, definitely repeatable. You can give people IQ tests all the fucking time, and you can look at all the predictions that the G factor makes, or belief in the G factor makes. And G has been robust enough to remain the dominant construct in psychometrics up to this date. And the reason it's remained the dominant construct up to this date is because it is so predictively valid. That's science. It doesn't mean that it's the most mechanistic explanation, that it finds all the dendrites and all the neural columns and all the path efficiencies. It means it makes predictions. The predictions are the test. The test can be falsified, and the more repeated the tests are, the better. Now, understanding how the brain works mechanistically, I know is actually more useful than the G factor in a lot of specific applications. You can do both. Just because I talk about how valuable the G factor is, doesn't mean I'm suddenly against brain research. Waving your hands around and going, intelligence is so super duper complex and you have to explain the incredibly complex structure of the brain, and until we do that, we'll just sit on our hands and say nothing and make no predictions. That's not science. And endless skepticism, endlessly saying, oh, we have to know more. Oh, we have to know more and more mechanisms before we can make any predictions. That's not scientific, okay? That's rational skeptic science TM. And this is also why the whole you have to control for everything argument is an unscientific demand. Now, aside from the practical impossibility of controlling for all environmental variables, this person who's making such a demand is deviating from the standard of predictive validity and falsifiability. Now, as it happens, most of the big arguments for race gaps have been gone into and shown to not matter in the specific. You know, we talk about income and nutrition and school quality and stereotype threat. So that's all nice stuff to point out, but let's not let the fact that we did this, that we did debunk these things, blind us to the fact that we never had any burden to do this. A high heritability theory makes valid predictions. An environment-only theory makes invalid predictions. That's all you need. The nutrition studies, the voucher studies, the stereotype threat studies, the adoption studies, all of that is very nice, and I'm glad we have it, but it's not fundamental. If our theory has better predictive validity, then that's it. You don't need anything else. I'll just end on two more methodological errors Kraut and Sandra make, and they're both related to not understanding heritability. Heritability is about variance. Think about a steak. Are the traits of a steak a result of the meat itself or of the cooking of the steak? Well, both. Well, what percent is cooking? What percent is the meat? That question makes no sense. That question is wrong. What we can say meaningful things about is the variation between steaks. We can say that the difference between these two steaks is a result of different meat, or it's a result of different cooking. And so when Sandra brings up Africa, and how nutrition plays a big role in Africa, this stems from a basic misunderstanding of what heritability is. When I say that access to nutrition isn't an important environmental variable in the United States, I'm talking about within the range of environments that the United States encompasses. Having part of your brain being eaten by a brain-eating virus could be a source of variation in cognitive ability within a population and would vary in frequency between populations as per how much they had the brain-eating virus. But that doesn't mean that this actually happens. And so variation in nutrition within Africa doesn't mean nutrition is a relevant variable within the United States. And the second problem is that these guys don't seem to intuitively get the principle of aggregation. There's a difference between dealing with an individual and dealing with a population. With a larger population, the variation down at lower levels averages out. For example, it's easier to predict how many trees will be in a square mile of forest than how many trees will be in a square meter. In sports, it's easier to predict how a team will do over a whole season than how they will do in a single game. It's easier to predict climate than it is to predict the weather of a single day. Similarly, it's easier to infer the heritability of height for a whole population than it is to predict how tall an individual person is going to be. It's also easier to predict the average height of a population in the next 20 years than it is to predict how tall a newborn will be when he's 20. Take the issue of affirmative action. That's an issue that hinges on the question of genetic equality between racial groups. The argument being that in a theoretical, totally equal playing field, aggregate race differences in economic outcomes wouldn't exist because the races on aggregate have the same genetic potentials. Now, most people at this point have accepted individual differences in genetic potentials and would assume differences in genetic potential between any two random groups that you draw a circle around. For example, if you drew a circle around the people in Fresno, California, and drew a circle around the people in Billings, Montana, those two populations would probably have some difference in genetic potential. I don't know what it is, but we intuitively know that it wouldn't be the same. It's really unlikely that it would be the same. But if one was to draw a circle around two populations that just so happen to correspond with the races, well then those now must have identical average genetic potentials on all traits. Not that all the individuals within the groups are the same, or that any two individuals being compared between groups are going to be the same in terms of their genetic potentials, but the average aggregation of those genetic potentials must be the same. Therefore, any life outcome differences between the races must be a result of circumstance, and that groups that do better are systematically privileged or less oppressed, whichever way you want to look at it. And so it is justified to discriminate against the privileged or less oppressed until outcomes between the groups are equalized. On this issue of affirmative action or anti-white race discrimination, these big aggregate group differences are what we care about. We don't care so much about the specific genes any individual person has. Now, I'm pretty sure Kraut is against institutional discrimination against whites, or affirmative action, given that he's anti-Muslim and anti-SJW. SJW! And yet, he is defending tooth and nail the root assumption used to justify institutional discrimination against whites. But let's not pretend this is anything other than a giant revenge quest against what Kraut thinks is the alt-right that started with his video, or the response to his video, Artificial Outrage. So even if Kraut were to become aware that he's kind of full on it on his methodological supremacism here, he's ego invested in his bad methodological argument at this point. Is this where you want it to be? Arguing for specific mechanism over predictive validity? Arguing for complexity and explaining things at a lower level versus predictive power? And digging really hard into this stance? Remember when your series was supposedly about the alt-right? Remember that? We know why you're doing this, Kraut. It's because all the arguments regarding general heritability and the heritability of group differences, they don't make many references to molecular genetics. They make a few, but it's primarily on the quantitative genetic side of things, because that's where you can get these big, robust replicable, repeatable heritability estimates. So you thought if you could just raise the bar and somehow require genes to be found for any heritability estimate to be made, then you could then dismiss divergent evolution in humans. The problem is that with this standard, you could dismiss all heritability and all of quantitative genetics. By these standards, you're going to have to dismiss the whole field of quantitative genetics, and you're going to have to dismiss what we know about the heritability of height, and you're going to have to dismiss all of these things because of your vendetta against quote-unquote the alt-right. Although at this point, it's really just devolved into video responses to me, and I guess coming up, it's going to be video responses to JF. It's pretty transparent what's going on and why this whole thing is the shit show that it is.